We are live. Thanks everybody for waiting for us. Appreciate you. This is going to be a pretty good one today. I'm really excited to introduce my friend and colleague Keiyu Sakurai. We both went to school together, and so I'm just really excited to actually chat with him again and for him to show off his insane workflow with Substance Painter. So, thank you all for joining us. Just a couple of things. If you've got any questions at all at any point, pop them in the chat here and we will get to them towards the end. Just so Keiyu can go through his process and show all the steps. And yeah, that'd be awesome. And then this will be available after it's over. So if you have to hop off early, you can definitely come back and watch. So thank you everybody for waiting and for joining us. So let's just start with intros. My name is Jaron Dorman. It's great to see you all. I work at Gravity Sketch on the marketing team, and I get to have conversations like this with incredible designers all over the world, and it's just a pleasure. So, KU, over to you real quick, just a quick intro.
Yeah, thank you for the intro, Jaron, and thank you everyone for showing up today. So I've been a freelance footwear designer for about 4 years now. I've worked with a variety of categories from women's lifestyle to snow sports such as ski and snowboarding. But I actually didn't start taking 3D seriously until about 4 years ago. That's when I really, try to search for different softwares and workflows that could improve the footwear design process. And it turned out really useful in my journey in freelancing because I work a lot with startups. They may have limited budgets, limited connections with factories that, may not allow them to sample as much. So having a really high fidelity way to validate in 3D allowed me to work around those restrictions pretty well. Yeah.
Awesome, man. And again, I know I've said this multiple times, but thanks for joining in today and
Oh yeah.
showing off a bit of your process. Um, so as you may have seen from the description and from the marketing, this is going to be a Gravity Sketch to Substance Painter workflow. And so what I'd love to start off with is just a bit of a, for those that maybe are new to this, a bit of a window into what you can do with Gravity Sketch in terms of footwear on the Gravity Sketch side. And so let me just quickly share my screen really quick for a video, and I'm just going to talk through it. So what we have here are a few different shoes in Gravity Sketch, and I just wanted to show everybody some different examples of levels of detail and fidelity. So as you can see, we've got like a loose sketch on the side. We also have like a form of a shoe there, like more of like a speed form with no detail. And then these are just like block out and more detailed block out examples of some shoes where you can block out more, yeah, essentially more detail around the last, creating laces and extra layers of surfaces over top of the shoe. And so I just wanted to show everybody that there's all different levels of detail that you can do within Gravity Sketch in terms of creating a basic form. And these are all models that you can export and bring into Substance to begin adding patterns and details like what we're going to see today with KU showing us his process. Today, we're going to be focusing on the example that you see here called form, where there really is no detail, but it's just a form that was created in Gravity Sketch. So KU is actually going to be using a model that I gave him from Gravity Sketch, and then he's going to take that further, adding patterns. So yeah, just as a recap, there's all different levels of detail that you can do within Gravity Sketch, creating the base shapes and base forms depending on whatever your preferences and what your workflow requires. So I will stop sharing screen with that.
Cool.
And I'll shoot it over to you, KU, if you want to
Yep.
dive right into it.
Yeah. Is this screen up? Cool. Okay. Is the screen showing up fine?
Yeah, it looks great.
Oh, okay, cool. So after you export from Gravity Sketch and once you UV unwrap your mesh in any software of your choice, and once you import it into Substance Painter, you do want to bake the base mesh maps. So you go to Mode, Bake Mesh Maps. This looks a little scary, but you don't really have to mess with any of these unless you're like baking high poly to low poly. Don't worry about it. Oftentimes, the only thing that I would change is maybe change the resolution to 2048, click baked, and you're set to go. And the reason why you should always do that before you start a project in Substance Painter is because there may be generators that you use down the line that may require those mesh maps. Those mesh maps include things like ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and stuff like that. But also, it's just a good tip because if you UV unwrapped incorrectly, or if your normals are oriented in the wrong way, those mesh maps will not come out right and you will see artifacts in it. So it's like a good indicator to like check that you've done everything correctly before you texture and then realize later down that, ooh, I messed up and I need to, UV unwrap. So that's kind of the base prep work that you should do. Also, I'd say in this case, sometimes I like to copy and paste certain parts of the mesh that are around the UV seam. And what I mean by that is here, you can take a look at the wireframe. So I just like to select the loop at the bottom and then copy and paste it over the UV seam in a separate mesh. And the reason why I do that is because if you look at this, these UV seams, often for footwear, you might have the UV seam at the collar and the heel and then the tread. And in this case, I had a general idea that I wanted a tread that wraps around to the sidewall of the midsole. So in that case, there's going to be this UV seam, and it's not going to be a big deal. You'll just see a small artifact, and I ended up, running into it anyways in the heel. But having a separate mesh that's like a duplicate of the bottom with a completely different UV map gives you this full canvas to work with, and you can go crazy with the tread this way. So really just like within this process in Substance Painter, it's all about setting the mesh up in a way where it's as blank of a canvas as much as possible. Most of this process is super procedural, but one thing that is destructive is that once you start texturing, it's hard to change the mesh, because if you change the mesh, then the UVs will change, and that means that the textures that you made won't apply. So it's really important to make sure that the base mesh is as flexible and as blank as possible if you're doing this process. So other than that,
Real quick on that one, KU.
yeah,
As far as
yeah.
UVs, what would you recommend? Some tools, like maybe Blender or something?
Yeah, so I use Blender, and in terms of working with Gravity Sketch, I do want to export with the control mesh, not the render mesh, just so it's easier to select the UV seams once you get into Blender.
Yeah.
And maybe even if you have like thickness in Gravity Sketch, I might have that on while I'm working in Gravity Sketch, turn that off at export, but then bring it into Blender, add a solidify modifier, and then do the UVs. It's just less edges that you have to select that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would recommend that. Yeah,
Cool.
for sure. Cool. And then besides that, in order for the displacement to show up, you want to turn on the displacement scale. I set it around 0.2. That's pretty strong, but it's always better to have it strong than weak and change it later. And I ramp up the subdivision count. Just do it up to whatever your computer can handle. So yeah, that's about it for the prep. Before we get working, so let me kind of reveal the design that I did for this mesh. So, even if this is something that I did to show this 3D process in Substance Painter, I did want to have some sort of baseline framework to guide the design. So after I received this mesh from Darren from Gravity Sketch, I thought it was a good base for a mule or slip-on. So the main thing I wanted to focus on from that was to have a strong toe-down design. Toe-down is important for any footwear, but I think it's especially important with mules. The fact that it's so easy on and off, you're going to see the toe-down more often. But specifically for this demo as well, I really wanted to emphasize how easy it is to put down lines that flow dynamically across the shoe, regardless of what angle you're looking at, which I feel like is the major upside of working in 3D, not just limited to Substance, but Gravity as well. You're never hyper fixated on one view, and through that, like your toe downs never feel like an afterthought of a side view. So there's been many times where I'm drawing in Substance Painter and I'm like, well, yeah, I would have never thought to like connect these lines if I was sketching or rendering in 2D. So I wanted a design that kind of emphasized that. If you can see here, like the heel line connects to the line that goes into the tread. And, in terms of like the toe down, I really wanted something that was graphically strong.
Looks sweet, man.
And have like a good visual depth of like multi-layered materials. So I have like a translucent ripstop that's almost like double lasted in the front half of the shoe, and that layers over the embossed and screen printed neoprene. And as that like kind of clashes, it gives an interesting visual effect. And I also wanted to show like how you can get these layered effects on a single mesh all through texturing. So yeah, that's like the basis of the design. So let's get down to going through the layers.
It looks awesome, man. A couple
Thank
people are
you.
saying fire. Looks awesome. Um, we have a question on UV, but unwrapping. But let's revisit that at the
Yeah,
end. I think.
yeah, for sure. Um, so let's start here, actually. So at this stage, if I'm ideating within Painter, I sometimes like to just get these general masks down to really see how I want to break up the form. So it would just be stuff like this. Like I went in and ideated just different ways, like what would the overlay panels look like? Like here, this is just like different top lines for the midsole.
Mm.
Mhm. And this is a part where if you already have like a 2D design, you can project a sketch on it and trace it and mask it out that way.
Yeah, I was
That's
gonna
another
ask that.
workflow you can do too. Yeah. But in this case, I just ideate a bunch just real quickly, like see what looks good, just see the overall silhouette.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of like how some people may do like thumbnail silhouette ideations in 2D. I think it's like the 3D version of this, where it's just really fast and you get the overall lines down.
Yes.
But once I have a lot, I might combine a few to see if something looks good. Sometimes it doesn't, and I might just like start building off of one mask. But in this case, I actually ended up combining two masks that I made. So it was like this one that was like, it's a more conceptual, like a little out there asymmetrical masking of the heel area, but I thought it was cool, but I thought it needed to be grounded by something that's more conventional to the eye for footwear. So I have this front half overlay. So that comes together.
I might be jumping ahead, but I noticed that
Yeah.
one like lighter mask is kind of transparent. Is
Yeah.
that by design? I would assume.
Oh yeah, just visualizing, because even at this point I did think I wanted to make it translucent. So here
Okay.
I have the opacity down to 70.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So from here, you want to start placing the anchor points on the mask that you like. So these are all, this looks complicated, but this isn't that bad. This is just all the layers that took to make this shape.
Okay.
And I have an anchor point on top of that. And anchor points are the most important thing of this process. Like it is the core that connects everything. It's almost like the wires or the connecting strings if you're working in like a node-based graph 3D software.
Mm.
It's like that, but because it's in a layer stack, we have this thing called anchor points, and you put it on top of the layer stack that you want to reference in other layers. So this is like a whole list. This is all the times that I reference this specific mask. So for example, let's just put a random color, random height. So we saw that this anchor point was named upper 3 mask. So let's add a black mask here. Add a fill layer. And then here, there's a drop down for anchor points. And then I just look for upper 3 mask. And here, you can reference it like that.
Wow.
And that's how you connect everything and it becomes procedural.
That's pretty incredible because you can go back and like erase away from that mask. I'm assuming,
Yeah.
even change like how much it's extruding
Mm-hmm.
outside of the
Mm-hmm.
surface. Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, exactly. And then I also had this mask for the midsole. The reason why it's blurred is because I wanted to give a little flexibility to how I want to use it in the future in the layers above. So if you look at this, if I want to just mask out a midsole material later down the line, this is where it needs to be. But let's say I wanted to make like a mud guard that is parallel to the top line of the midsole, but is offset and is higher in the upper. So by having it blurred, I can scrunch down the values and do these kinds of offsets
Oh
and
wow.
kind of build off of that later down the line. And there's going to be points where I'm going to talk about the points where it becomes useful. But yeah, you can do that type of stuff. And histogram scan is like something that like scrunches down the level and you can choose which level you're selecting. It's like levels, but all into one
Mm.
button or slider. Yep. So yeah, I think that's about it for the base masks. So let's move on to going over, yeah, the base of the upper, I'd say. Yeah, let's hide some things. Cool. You can hide that also too. So for this neoprene upper, this was a material. It's labeled spandex. It's from the Adobe Assets library, but from afar it kind of reads as neoprene. So I've been using that for neoprene uppers. But that's just something that I drag and drop into the fill layer. But once I do that, in order to isolate it to the upper, I add a black mask. And then here, I reference the midsole mask that I was just talking about. So by default, it'll look something like this, but with every anchor point or fill layer, there's a levels. So you can kind of invert it here and just isolate
Oh, that's
the
cool.
upper. Yeah. But I also wanted a different material for the lining. So I wanted to get rid of that lining and insole part. So I added a paint layer. And then one of the tools that you have in Substance Painter that's really useful is fill by UV island. So you just fill depending on which UV island it's on. So you could just take this, set the stroke to black, erase the lining, erase the insole in the 2D view, and here you go. You have
Wow.
the neoprene mask. Yeah. And
Simple.
it's neoprene, so there's going to be a bit of height to it, right? So I add a fill layer with a bit of height, and then I use the same mask that I used in the previous layer. So I had an anchor point here. I reference that same anchor point here, start out with that, but then I reference the other mask that we talked about early on that blocks out the heel area. So this is what it looks like default, what I showed you earlier, if you remember. Um, but then I want to invert that and then use that to subtract the heel counter from it because I want the heel counter to look like it's holding down the neoprene.
Yeah.
So I want to subtract that from the puff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I bevel it to give that softness and then just adjust the bevel with levels a little bit. And that's how you get this bit of a height to it. So
Wow. Okay.
yeah.
So it's all about creating these masks and creating these sections that then you can go and
Mhm.
reference multiple times over
Yeah. Yeah.
on on
Exactly.
these different layers. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I'll just clarify
Yeah.
for everybody watching. You can go back and replay this as many times as you want. If it's not making sense, go and replay it. This will be available after it's over. But yeah, please continue.
Yeah. Oh, and the one thing I do want to go in depth in, you know how I subtracted this mask
Yeah.
from the upper. So all these layers, they have their individual blend modes, just like Photoshop. So it has all the, you know, multiply, screen, subtract, divide, all the things that you have in a Photoshop layer, you have. And you kind of use that just like how you would with a clipping mask in Photoshop or the Pathfinder tool in Illustrator to kind of like boolean out the different masks from each other. So like you said, you never have to like redraw everything. You just keep referencing the same thing over and over.
Mm.
Yeah. So
I would assume too, like back to earlier when you were showing like the different kind of iterative masks you were drawing.
Yeah,
You can always maybe go back to those and reference those if you want and play with like and
exactly.
just see what happens. To
Yeah,
the design if you reference a different mask versus this design direction that you settled on.
yeah. No, this is a process that you can have a lot of control, but also let a lot of like random things happen. Even if you developed off of that single mass, you can
Yeah,
change to the other mass and like have a happy surprise. So yeah,
yeah,
it's a really fun workflow.
cool.
Yeah, yeah. So for the heel counter, I was thinking this heel counter would be like a molded TPU piece. So with that being said, it would be like a kind of shiny, pretty smooth material where I don't want the properties of the neoprene below to come through. And the reason why I say that is because by default, when you add a new fill layer, the colors, the colors below, they don't come through. It's white here, it's white as it's supposed to be.
Hmm.
But for normal data, by default, it's set so the normal data of the layers below come through. So what you need to do is make sure that this layer's normal data overrides everything below. And you can do that by changing your normal blend mode. So this is the blend mode that we were just talking about, how it exists in Photoshop. You set that to normal. And that's
Mm.
how you can override it and get this smooth surface. And that's exactly what I did here for this heel counter.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
that makes
then
sense.
I added some height to it. So this is a fill layer with 0.05 height. And then I added, it's the same mask that I used for the base material, but I added a little bit of a blur to it. Because if you don't add blur to your displacements, it's going to look jagged like this.
Hmm.
Even for the most hardest edges that you intend to have in your design, you need to blur it a little bit. So you get rid of the jaggedness. So you add blur, and if you want to bring it in, you can use levels to make it tight and make the slope tighter.
What
And
do you call those where those layers where they're blur and height? Those are just are those filters
yeah, yeah, they're
basically.
filters.
Okay,
Levels is something on its own, but like blur is a filter. Yeah,
got
yeah,
it. Okay.
yeah. So sometimes people ask like, why do I have like the height and the base material on a separate layer? Well, if you look, the height's blurred, but the base material is it's a little more of a hard edge. And the reason why I have them separate is because if I add the color on the same height layer, it's not going to make it to the bottom edge of the
Mm.
extrusion. It's going to fade out because I wanted the height to fade out and be soft, but I don't want the color to. So I always keep that separate. A harder mask for the base material and a softer mask for the height. Yeah.
That's a very like minute but important detail I think to add to that.
Mhm.
Make sure that realism is consistent.
Yeah, and that's something that's applicable to any software, not just Substance. When you're creating like a displacement map in Photoshop and you're wondering why it's so jagged, you just have to blur it a little bit. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So then I want to populate this area with more detail. So I add a deboss to it, and how I do that is start out with this mask, blur it, and then I use a histogram to bring it in, and that's how I offset a lot of the lines in my designs. I never redraw anything.
Mm.
Blur, this gets this, it increases the grayscale range on the edge, and you can really bring it in to have it offset like that. But I wanted the ledge of this deboss to be thin here, but thicker at the bottom. So it really feels like it's sitting in the midsole. And that's where the blurred midsole that I referred to earlier came in really handy, because I could just subtract that really extended blurred range and subtract it in a way where the bottom is thicker than the the top edges. So
Um, just so maybe this might be for other people that may not be understanding as well. You said you
yeah,
brought in that like that midsole mask
yeah,
back in.
yeah,
Um, can you just explain again how you're able to bring just that part of it back in?
yeah.
Is it because you're combining an old mask with this mask, and so with the combination of those two masks, you get that
Mhm.
smaller section? Is that like
Yeah,
basically the
so I
answer?
just straight up I bring it in. So this let me go here. So if you remember, oh yeah, no, this was, I was seeing it the whole time. That this really blurred mask, that
Right.
was the visual mask, yeah. And here I just subtract. I just use that to subtract
Oh, I
off of what
see.
I had here. Yeah,
Got it. Okay.
yeah. So regularly it would look like this, but
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
I see.
I subtract.
You're using it like it's basically, I mean, just like in Photoshop, you're just using all these different layers, all these masks to subtract, add to each
Mhm.
other. Also, kind of similar to probably some Illustrator tools too, in a way.
Yeah, yeah. The
Um,
Pathfinder stuff. Yeah,
yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Got it. All right.
yeah,
I just wanted to get like a mentality understanding
yeah,
around
yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting shift of mentality compared to other 3D softwares where I think like if you are a little more comfortable in like rendering in Photoshop, it could come a little easier depending on the person, I
Sure.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I have this mask I want to populate here with a little more detail. So, I have an anchor point here. I reference it in this layer, and then I multiply. I add a different texture over it, and I multiply it. So this texture is cropped into the inside. So this hexagon triangle, it's just the default texture that you can find in Substance Painter. So I have like a negative height on here, so you get this kind of detail sitting inside. And then similar method with filling out the outside is I just combine all the masks that I made up to this point, kind of brought it in. I wanted to not be all the way to the edge, so I have a bevel and a histogram, and then I multiply that with circles, and that's how I get this heel counter. Yeah.
So the way you're getting those, the way you're combining those masks is, are you changing the layer status? Because I noticed there was like
Mhm. Yeah.
normal,
So
and
I'm
then there was like
changing.
replace or something on there.
Yeah. Yeah. So by default, the filters replace. I don't usually touch the filter blend modes, but with the
Okay.
fill laters, yeah, I usually the only ones that I use commonly is subtract, screen, multiply, and
Okay.
divide.
Got it.
That's pretty much it.
Got it.
Which I think a lot of people are familiar with.
Yeah.
Working with like black backgrounds in Photoshop, so
Yes, for
it
sure.
works the same exact way. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
This is very
Cool.
cool.
Yeah, and then for the heel seam, the stitch itself very straightforward. It's a path tool with a stitch tool on it. But what's interesting is the seam tape over it. Now, previously, we talked about with the blend modes of how we don't want the normal data of the neoprene to show up on the heel counter. And here, I actually do want the normal data of the stitch to show up through the seam tape because that's how it would be in real life if you tape over a seam and the stitch. So how I do that is I set the blend mode of the normal channel to normal, but I lower the opacity. So if you look here, you can still kind of see the bumps of the stitch, but it's not fully defined. If I set the opacity to 0, the normal data and the height data of the stitch comes through. But I want to mute it a little bit. So I set that to like 60%. So you still kind of see the bumps coming from the stitch, but you don't see it so defined, and it
Right.
looks how it should be with the tape over it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I did that with the base color too. I set the opacity to 80%, so you still see the color of the stitch coming through. Yeah. So yeah, that's about it for like the base of the upper. Let's move on to the underlay print and debossing that I did up front. So this area. So pretty much all these lines and textures are based off of these two textures that I generated. One is very straightforward. So in just as upfront, like in Substance Painter, when you want the best way to get that is just get a gradient texture, up the contrast, up the tiling. That's how you get like a stripe texture super easy. Now, this is what it looks like if it's just on the basic UV projection. But sometimes I want to just mess around and see what it looks like in other projection modes. So I'm sure like in any software, rendering software, you have like box projection, you have planar projection, different ways you can project textures. Now, spherical, that's usually made for something spherical, but you can actually use that to your advantage and get some interesting graphics out of it. So this is the same gradient texture that I just showed you in a UV projection. But once I get it into the spherical texture, it comes into this really fun radial lines that project, and I kind of centered it in the middle of the toe down, and I wanted to give that really impactful toe down design.
Yeah.
So that's one line that I made. The second line, so this is probably what a lot of people are interested in after seeing my video doing the treads. And what it is you just plug in this base mask into a generator that I made in Substance Designer, and it creates all these offset lines from that single generator. If you go to my website s-keiyu.com and go to the page that describes my process in Substance Designer, there is a link there for the generator, so you can get that. But how that generator is working is actually quite simple. So, oh no, I had that already. Okay. So let's just say this is just the base mask and you want to bevel it. And why I want to bevel it is because the place where the bevel is, the space at the edge of the shape where there's a range of grayscale from dark to white, that's where this generator assigns these lines. So kind of plug that in, and then if you mess with the bevel, you can kind of mess with how much you want to like offset the lines from the edge of the shape. Wow. So with this same generator, so if you look right now, like the bevel goes to here, line goes here. So in the same generator, you can change the amount of rings that you want to add. So it's pretty powerful.
Wow.
But this is one of those things that I made in Designer where like it seems crazy, but it's really just one node in Designer that does this that I just wish existed in Painter. So yeah, it's a pretty simple tool.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful.
Yep. So then that gets referenced in these layers. So for this, I have this mask that's isolating this upper. And then I multiply that with that radial line we just talked about. And then I subtract that second line from it. And the reason why I do that is because if you look, if I turn on the second lines, you get a little bit of outline around it. And just a small detail that I found would look better.
Yeah.
And then, with this second set of lines, I also multiply that with a gradient on another layer. So then you get this type of gradient for one set of lines and get an interesting detail. Yeah. And then you can combine that to, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's amazing that you haven't drawn anything yet at this point. Yeah. It's pretty incredible. Like it's all generated from shapes and patterns. It's pretty amazing. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, you're good. So by combining those two textures, this is how I get like the emboss or the deboss into the neoprene. So here's the two textures. I blur a little bit because when you emboss or deboss fabric, it's pretty soft. You tighten that up a little bit with levels, just confine that to the upper, and you get something like this where it's kind of puffing out between the prints.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to give a little bit of height to the print. So, just the inverse of that. And yeah, this is it for the underlay parts where, the base graphics that seem layered afterwards. So then we'll go to this main overlay here. And the first thing I want to tackle with this is, how to make it look like this material is actually like shrouding over or is lasted over all the materials below it. And it's all done by the single layer that I have here called underlay blur. If I turn it off, you will see that all the height from below is sharp and showing like that, and that doesn't look right, for a ripstop that's being pulled over.
Mm-hmm.
So how you can blur that is by setting your layer blend mode to pass through for each channel. And what pass through does is it, as the name tells you, it just lets all data pass through. But also you can add a filter along it. So you can add a filter on the blur, color, any of the channels, and kind of make it look how it is right now. So in this case, I have a blur for height, and then I have a separate blur for color. So that's how you get this illusion that these these objects are layered.
Um, question.
Yeah.
I can Substance Painter do translucent materials?
Yes.
But
I
that wouldn't
think
be a good workflow for this, would you say?
if you just like how I duplicated the bottom, the tread
Mm-hmm.
mesh for the sake of UVs, if I had like another duplicate mesh already in here, you can do that. But I think I might be wrong. But I think with how you work with like a GPU preview here in Substance Painter,
Uh-huh.
I think it struggles to show like an accurate translucency.
Gotcha.
So yeah, you can do it for sure.
This
You
gives you a
can,
bit more
yeah,
control too over the way that translucency effect looks
yeah,
with the layers underneath too. So
yeah. So on top of that, I add the ripstop material, and then I also set the base color to 75. So you get a little tint of the color, but you still see what's under. So if you raise this, you won't see anything. If you lower this, you'll see more. Set it back to 75. And then, so another cool tool that I want to show is how I got these edge details. And how I did that
yeah.
is with this filter called mask outline. So here we have this base mask that we've been seeing this whole time. If you add a mask outline filter on top of it, it automatically outlines the edge of the entire shape. So then you can just tighten it with a histogram, and that's how I got this little ledge all the way around where the ripstop gets stitched down to the upper.
Wow.
Yeah. So with that, and then additionally with stitching, so for this stitching, unlike the seam back in the heel, I did this with a generator that I made by myself. But it's like a single node in Designer again. But this is something where I can plug in, this mask, and it automatically erases the stitch along the shape, so you don't have to retrace with the path tool. So I don't have this generator uploaded onto my website yet because I have to simplify and optimize it for performance, but I do have something similar called like array along shape. So if you go to my website and you click on the link that leads to the Adobe community assets website, you'll be able to download something similar and do something similar with it. But this is really powerful because it's single click. All I'm doing is inputting this mask into this generator here mask, and I have all these settings that you can change the color, you can change the thickness, you can change the puckering of the stitches. I try to imitate like the default stitch tools as much as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, this is powerful.
So
Wow.
yeah. So, and then for the hot melt TPU overlays I have here, I have this one little outline around it. This is done the same way that I just talked about with mask outline, how I got this edge. So that's pretty straightforward. But for this second hot melt, so this is another place where that midsole blur came in handy, because I didn't want this hot melt to be in line with the midsole. I wanted it to be offset a little below the midsole line. So that allowed me to get it a little below, but still parallel. And then once I masked these things out, I multiplied this mask with another gradient texture that I projected spherically. And it's down here. And the reason why it's down, that was done spherically. The reason why it's down here is because I also reference the same texture in this outsole heel area. So that's one of the really fun things you can do in Substance Painter is really, like, even though this is a busy design, you can bring everything together in cohesion by referencing the same texture across different materials and properties. Like, for example, if I go in here and I turn this off, let's duplicate it, and we can do something like circles, increase the tiling a little bit. So you will see that reflected across the outsole and the hot melt print. So this is the part where you can really have fun, and just really experiment with the different textures that's already available in Substance Painter. Yeah, and then amazing. The third texture I have was like a halftone that decreases in scale from back to front. So this is another thing I exported from Designer called a tile sampler. You have a tile generator that comes with Painter. It does most of the things that tile sampler does. One thing it doesn't do is tile sampler allows a secondary input to manipulate these small instances in a different way. So how I use that here is I inputted this gradient into the tile sampler to manipulate the scale of the circles, because I didn't just want like an opacity fade where, from back to front, I wanted it to scale down. I think it looks better that way. So this map right here is driving the scale of these dots, and I just framed that in with all the masks, and then that's how I get this halftone effect.
Wow.
Yeah. So while we're here, let me cover just how anchor points can be really useful in making colorways. So just like how I showed how you can anchor point between the layers in the black masks, you can anchor point anything else, like all these different properties like color, height, roughness, metal, all that. If you want that to be the same somewhere else, you can put an anchor point and reference it. So with that case, I have this anchor point referenced in this hot melt print, this edge, and this outsole too. So when I'm figuring out colors, I might, start pretty randomly, work with each individual panel, not thinking about color blocking at first. But once I found that, I like this color blocking of this front half being one color, I will connect all the different components with the single anchor point. So if I change this, everything else will change as well. Yeah. And not only that, like once you go to like the destination layer, so let's go back to this edge color that we had. You can once you get to this layer, you can add like a HSL, which is just hue, saturation, and lightness, and change it a little bit. So it's not the exact color that you originally referenced through the anchor point, because there's a lot of shoes that are tonal out there, especially like lifestyle shoes, and you can color block a part of the shoe with similar hue, but still get a little bit of depth by changing, the saturation or the value.
Yeah.
So it's in the same hue range, but like you can get that slight depth in the colors, and that's
it's a nice little artistic trick there.
Yeah. So yeah, that's how you kind of easily pump out colorways. Besides that, on this main mesh, let's just quickly go over how I did this outsole portion. Just this part, because I think it would be interesting. So with this heel part, so this is what the mask looks like. So, same old. Here I multiplied it with that midsole, like a blurred midsole mask. Just cleaned it up a little bit, blurred it. It's loading a little bit. It's this one. It's this one that's labor intensive. Okay,
No
cool.
worries.
And you bring it in. So the reason why I did all the blurring is because, I want that offset. But again, I wanted a bigger offset from the midsole, the top of the midsole. And that's why this, oh, that's going to take a long time, isn't it? Yeah, well, that's why the blurred midsole mask that I had, it came in handy in a similar way that I did with the heel counter previously.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. But then I multiply it with the same texture that I used here. So that's all in line, that's all in sync. And I added like a single black path to it just to break it up, something parallel to this line here. And then I added another path in a similar way, but I set the opacity to 42. So it doesn't cut all the way through. It just gives like a different visual effect to it and visual depth. And yeah, that's how I get something intriguing and interesting in that detail. Yeah.
So I noticed in your video that you shared,
Mm-hmm.
you had you kind of had like these knobby designs for the outsole,
Yeah.
grip tread basically.
Yeah.
But they were conforming around
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
paths that you were
Yeah.
drawing. Is that how basically that works here?
Yeah.
Where you basically like those. I noticed that the shapes would conform around it. If you could just maybe
Mm-hmm.
explain that or touch on that.
Yeah. So we'll go over that actually just right now once we get to the main separate outsole mesh.
Okay.
Yeah. So for here. So let's just isolate it first. So first things first, I want to just trim all the mesh that I don't need with an opacity path. So I set the opacity to 0, and then I transfer all the masks that I used in the main mesh to make this heel part. I transfer that, copied and pasted to here, invert it, and that's how I can kind of trim the tread to just this shape.
Okay.
Yeah. And using that same mask, I'm going to add a little bit of height to it, just so it comes out of that mesh. This base color, so this was instanced from that the color I did here, where if I change it up here, it changed it down here. And this is how it looks like here. Like, hey, it's connected here in the outsole.
How is it connected again? Can you just show that
Yeah.
again?
So if you're working within a single texture set, you can use anchor points. But if you want to instance a color or material property to a different texture set, you need to instance it. So you just right click on the layer and
Okay.
click instantiate across texture set, and yeah,
Okay.
that's how you
Gotcha.
do it. Yeah. So this tread, this is where you were talking about. So I did something similar for this, one of the lines up here as an underlay, but it's pretty much similar to what I showed previously. So this is the mask that gets fed into that offset outlines generator that I talked about, and that's how it creates this interesting texture. And how I can manipulate how the tread changes with the path is right here. So you can see right here, I have just like a black stroke that splits this main mask. And if I place another stroke here, you can kind of see the same effect.
Wow.
Because it changes the input of
Yeah.
what's going into the generator. So this is another super fun part where once you have this set up, it doesn't take long to set it up. You can really mess around, and it looks really interesting because this this base mask, this simple lines, sharp edges, this gets blurred here. And that's how all these edges that come out of the generator are soft and rounded and filleted.
Mm.
Yeah. So
Wow.
so you just manipulate the paths that happen before you plug it into the generator, and that's how you can, manipulate it in any way you want and make interesting tread patterns out of it. Yeah.
That's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Um, yeah, this is great. I'll let you continue
Yeah.
unless this is
Yeah. No, I have a little bit more. So
okay. Yeah.
in this case, the tread right now, it's a little sharp. I want it to be like a flat contact to the ground. So I take levels and I flat out the high end. Now you can see it in the mask, but that's what actually happens in the tread as well. So levels really powerful. Use that to really shape your extrusions and bevels in the way that you want to. So for here, before I did this, I saw that there's a big opening space, and I did that on purpose because I wanted a variety of textures that you see on the tread. So just like how I beveled the texture previously, I do it again here to here. Then it's a lot stronger bevel, so I can, tighten the grayscale and make this mask really small so it fits inside the tread that I made. And then I multiply it with another gradient texture that's spherically projected. That's why you see this radial texture in the middle. And then I multiply just straight gradient lines that's UV projected, and that's how I got this interesting detail in the middle. And I wanted to raise that to the same level as the rest of the treads, so I raise that here. It's the same exact mask. It's nothing complicated. But once I get here, I added these little textures that are on the tip of the tread where it makes contact with the ground. If you look at any outsole design, you will see some sort of texture on the tip of the tread.
Yeah.
And how I do that is I reference this mask that I made to drive this base height, and I reference it here, and I really tighten the grayscale ranges. So you can do this with the histogram too. Here, I just tighten the levels, so only the tip top, the widest parts of the mask remain. Then I just blur it a little bit, bring it in a little bit, and then multiply that with a circles texture. And that's how I get something on the tip, just the tip. Yeah. And then just as a final finishing touch, just to make it pop out a little more, even though we're visualizing like a new shoe that's not worn, it's sometimes good to add a little bit of like material defects to make it look realistic, especially if you're working in 3D. So in this case, I did the same method as I did with the textures at the tip of the tread. I added a little bit of like a color wear at the tip of the tread. I don't know if you can see, but it's more like a dark red here.
Oh yeah.
But tip, it's a little lighter. And how I did that is same thing. Reference the map that I made below, tighten it a little bit with a histogram, and then set a layer with like an 80% white, gray. Set the blend mode to soft light. What soft light does is it just lightens the color below it, and that's how you can get this slight wear on the material. And this is something that I just wanted to do subtle. But if you want to do a concept that, like a golden goose, where it's like those shoes come worn and like distress, you can go crazy with the same effect and like make the wear look even crazier like this.
Yeah.
So yeah, really cool. That's I think that would cover everything that I wanted to talk about. So yeah.
Wow.
Let me know about any of the questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Keiyu, for running through this process. It's been eye opening. I've learned a lot just sitting here in this this 55 minutes we've been we've been going through this. So I'm definitely going to be watching it back. I'm sure a lot of other people are going to be watching this back as
Mhm.
well. Um, there's definitely we definitely have some questions.
Yeah.
Some of them I think I would encourage you all to definitely just go and watch a replay,
Mhm.
like just go back and see how KU did some of the steps. But let's just look through here. Um, let's see here. Also, everyone's just saying thank you. Looks amazing. This is golden.
No,
So
thank you
yeah,
to everyone.
this is great.
Thank you to you
Okay.
guys.
Um, let's see here for Shihan. I think how are you creating these shapes for the mask without drawing it? I would say just go watch the video back. It's KU using a combination of all the masks like he's been showing, and I think um, he even showed it again. I think after a bit there
I don't
towards the
think I
end,
actually
but
showed me putting down the strokes, so I could go over
okay,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
If you want to touch on that,
Yeah, so all that is just something like this. So you can use a stroke, a brush. But in my case, after they introduced the path tool into Substance Painter, oh, let's freeze it up. So uh, 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 oh, but it's yeah,
it's thinking.
yeah. It has a lot of things connected to it. That's why it's a lot slower at this point. Um, but yeah, let me just and I sometimes might work in like a lower resolution when I go back to change the mask. So like right now it's at 2K, but when I go back to adjust the mask after I've done everything, I might go down to like 1024 by 1024 just for the software to process things a lot faster. Um, yeah, we could just do it up here, honestly. So it's basically a combination of like um, just literally stroking it with a brush like this, or I might use a path tool like this to get the shape, close the shape, and there is this filter that somebody made. I forgot the person that made this, so I can't give credit. But if you look up ask a path fill on Google, it'll probably come up. It automatically fills the path for you. I think, as far as I'm aware, they're working on a feature that's native to Substance where the path tool is going to automatically fill, or you have the option to fill, but it doesn't. So you just add this filter to it, and it automatically just fills the path that you made, and that's how I kind of mask out the different masks that I made in the beginning. Yeah, it's pretty
Okay,
simple. It's no different than how you would in Photoshop or Illustrator. Yeah,
yeah, that's good to cover.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, thank you for
yeah,
touching on that, especially
yeah.
since it's uh, probably something you have to download external to Substance from the marketplace, possibly.
Yeah, from
Or
the community assets. If you look up Ask Path Fill, it should come up. And who knows? They might just add it native before we
yeah,
know it. So yeah.
um, let's see. There's a question here. Um, there's a question around UV unwrapping,
Hmm.
um, and I think that might be a good topic to touch on for a minute here.
Yeah.
Um, UV unwrapping. How are you protecting the seam lines? And how are you working around those the seams for the UVs? And then um, there's a question specifically from Tan here that says UV. I'm asking about UV wrapping because it might be important for having a good balance between uh, texture density and less distortion while being able to have continuity between the outsole and midsole.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, So maybe just if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, so in my case, let me just so I do usually have like some general idea of the design I want. So I'll place my UV seams based off of that. But in terms of like textile density, sometimes if I have so many parts, yeah, I'll go into actually using UDIMs and using multiple tiles so I get the maximum resolution. But this one, it was just there weren't that many parts. So let this load a little bit. Um, so what I did was I just scaled the UV islands of the lining a little bit down and then blew up the UV scale of the outer and the midsole and the tread. So I get maximum resolutions for the places that I really need it. Here we go. Okay, so you see here that that's the lining UV. So
Yeah.
I know that I didn't really need that much detail in that, so I made that small and like really blew up these ones. But
Hmm.
when making this extra bottom mesh, yeah, I did make sure to have the textile density at least the same between this and the main mesh. So when I'm instancing textures, it tiles out in the same consistent way. Yeah.
And then Mattia is talking about UV seams, so protecting the seams, preventing from artifacts. And that's actually a question I did have too. Was like because I
Mhm.
noticed that there were some little artifacts from the UVs. How are
Yeah.
you working around those?
Yeah. So how I did that was by making this um duplicate mesh for the tread, and that worked well. But this one, this back heel part, I didn't really think of that or expect that. So yeah, this became unavoidable with the UV seams here. You can see them. But the reason why it works right now somewhat, or the texture is like continuous, is because these textures that I have here are projected in 3D space. So like I said, this was a texture that's projected from a sphere.
Right.
So even though there may be artifacts in the displacement, if you try to use more 3D space textures instead of 2D space textures, you can get around UV seams.
Okay.
But other than that, it's just about like placing it where there would be a seam in real life in the shoe. So in the case here for the shoe, the heel part was like perfect.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So
the
so
one way to
maybe
avoid it is to make a duplicate. Yeah.
got it. Um, so maybe as like a recommendation for those watching, it would be good to maybe think about where the major breaks in the design will be,
Yeah.
like the outsole, midsole,
Yeah.
upper, and kind of have a little bit of think around that, knowing that it might change. But yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good point to bring up.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and you can make as many of these duplicate meshes and import them as we want. Like it doesn't take a whole lot of time. Like for this one, I have a mesh that, just kind of ended here, but you could have one that goes up here. If you have, in this case, I had a textile back with that seam. But if you wanted to have a heel counter that actually went all the way through and you had a molded part here and you don't want to deal with the UV seam, what you could have done is just like um pretty much select like this back half. This back half and like copy and paste it in Blender and UV unwrap it in a way that you don't run into the heel counter, and that's how you can get around in certain places that are like absolutely unavoidable. But you do have to plan ahead.
yeah.
You just do it in excess. So once you get into Painter, you don't run into that problem. Yeah.
Um, Tan says, so we're touching the limit possibly then for now of the process. Sometimes you need to change the UV projection, otherwise you are stuck and would need to go back to your 3D program. Do you think that's accurate to say?
I'd say so. I'd say
Okay.
so. Yeah, you just need to plan all
Okay.
well. But yeah, if there's like a drastic change, then yeah, you do need to go back. Yeah.
Question back to this is from Nathaniel Lee. Um, when you were showing that how you're drawing the path tool, closing it, and
Mhm,
filling it, if
mhm,
you don't have that extra tool or that plug-in, can you just
mhm.
can you just hand brush in and
Yeah,
fill it
you
in?
could fill it in. That's what
Okay.
I did before I found the filter. So
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a
yeah,
good question out there. Thanks, Nathaniel.
yeah.
Um, and then we'll maybe do let's do maybe like one or two more questions
Yeah,
and then we'll wrap it up. But
yeah.
we've got a question. Can you explain how he was able to cut the tooling with the mask into different layers? Um, I would say definitely go back and watch unless you wanted to show that again, KU. But you can definitely go back and watch the video because KU was going through the different layers and how things were cutting through. So yes, um, we're also for Gravity Sketch. Best software for modeling shoes, footwear outside of Gravity Sketch. Um, there's other tools. There's Blender.
Mhm,
I mean,
mhm.
there's tons of 3D tools out there.
Yeah.
The reason why, I mean, I obviously this is Gravity Sketch YouTube, and we're talking about Gravity Sketch
Mhm,
here as a workflow with Substance. Um, but you can um, very easily use uh, Gravity Sketch models with lots of other 3D programs. There's so many people in our community that are taking models out of Gravity Sketch, bringing it into Blender,
yeah.
and doing some further work on them. Obviously, in this case, we're bringing a model from Gravity Sketch straight into Substance. Um, there were UVs done that were done in Blender for this, and so I I'm a little biased, but also I do think it is actually true that creating base meshes of footwear in Gravity Sketch is like
Mhm,
the best experience, just because you have the
mhm.
spatial experience of having that
Yeah.
1-to-1 scale. You're able to move around the design like you would an object in real life, and so you're getting that true to life experience without obviously having the physical thing in your hand. Um, the nature of also creating Gravity Sketch is very like hands-on,
Mhm,
handcrafted experience, and I find that I'm able to think through my designs more intuitively that way.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and this is not just my words. This is the feedback we've gotten from our wider community and so many people that have been jumping into Gravity Sketch for the first time. They really feel like they can actually express themselves more naturally in Gravity
mhm.
Sketch, working through the design, the form, the shape that they're trying to express. Um, Whereas maybe tools in Blender, it's a little bit there's maybe too many steps involved. Nudging things, changing views on a screen. In VR, it's just you're making those decisions a lot more quick. Um, that'd be my 2 cents about
Yeah.
creating base meshes. Um, my dream workflow would be creating base shoe models and meshes and gravity, and then doing something like what KU just demoed for us today.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that, KU, but
Yeah. No, and I think each software has its strengths and which part of the footwear design development process you're in. I
yeah,
think Gravity Sketch is way better if you are in the absolute blue sky phase of where you're just figuring out surfacing and overall forms. You really can't do that in Painter. So with that, I think that's where Gravity Sketch shines. I think where Substance shines is if you're like an inline designer and you have like strict set of parameters, you already have an upper, you may already have like a previous version of the design that, hey, let's make a version 2 of this model, and you have these strict parameters that you're working within. That's where I think Substance Painter shines as like making new iterations. So I think it's never like one's better than the other. I think each tool has its appropriate place in the pipeline, and it doesn't mean that Substance Painter can't do the blue sky stuff either. And it doesn't mean gravity can't do like the really refined and small detail changes either. But I think, yeah, if you like a lot the softwares at a specific, to each individual part of the development process, I think you'll have like a pretty cool pipeline. Yeah.
Um, Thanks, KU. I do think
Yeah.
this is a pretty good question. Probably maybe something you could touch on briefly is is there a way to save different colorways or different like basically this entire stack of layers that you have to create
Mhm.
this final design, is that something you could package up in the same file and maybe do like a different iteration?
Yes. So I would just save a copy, but what you can also do is if you have it, so you just put everything in a folder, and then you just right click create smart material, and that comes into your library and you can access it in any other project. So sometimes so in the situations where I actually do have to change the mesh, but I do also have transferable textures, that's how I transfer one texture that I made in one mesh to another mesh that has a different UV map. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good. I think that was a good one to cover.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, awesome. Let me just make sure. I think we've covered a lot of questions. Uh, let's see. This person's just saying, wondering how you got such clean threads. I've tried
Mhm.
it a couple of times, but my lines get very pixelated. Would you say that's just the density of the mesh, KU, that you're
Um,
working with?
Density of the mesh, the resolution of the texture, but
Yeah.
also how your UVs are aligned. So depending on the line that you have, if it runs diagonal in a 2D space, it's
Mm-hmm.
gonna pixelate a little bit. If
Yeah.
it's in line, vertical, horizontal, then it won't pixelate. So that's another thing.
Okay.
And I think the other thing is just like I said, always blur your displacements, your
Yeah.
extrusions, even if you want it to be sharp. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Great.
yeah.
Well, I think that's it for today. Everybody, thank you
Cool.
so much for watching and for joining in with us. And if you missed it or if you came in kind of like towards the end, you can as soon as this live's over, you can go back and watch it from the beginning. So you could just watch it as many times as you want if something wasn't clear. Also, something I meant to do, but is put KU's website in the description.
Mhm,
His
mhm.
Instagram is in the description, so you can definitely go check him out on there, and his website is linked on his Instagram. But I'll go ahead and put your website as well
Yeah,
on the description, KU, so people can go and reference those other files and your kind of your walkthrough that you have on there. Um,
yeah,
so thank you so much. Thank you, KU, for running through this
yeah,
today and just like
yeah.
going in depth with us, answering all the questions. Really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for having me, Jaren. And for anyone who has questions, feel free to reach out to me directly on Instagram. That's linked in the bio of this video. Just I'm always down to help and maybe even do one-on-ones with people as well. So yeah, reach out if I wasn't clear with something because I packed in a lot of information in an hour. So yeah, definitely. And thank you so much, Sharon, for having me on.
Of course, man. Thank you,
Yeah,
KU. Thank you, everybody. And that's it. Bye now.
yeah. See you.